right, we're going to go ahead and get started, and we will be introducing our speaker.
All right. Hi, everyone. Delia Baldassarri is a professor in the sociology department at New York University. She also holds appointments in the Wilk Family Department of Politics and the Management of Organizations Department at the Stern School of Business. Her research intersects the areas of social networks with economic, political, and analytic sociology. Broadly, she studies solidarity and cooperation in diverse communities using a variety of methods, including experimental and fieldwork. Dr. Baldassarri has received numerous awards, including the Freeman Award in Social Network Analysis, the Raymond Boone Award, and the Hans L. Zetterberg Prize in Sociology. Her work has been published in many respected journals such as Science, Nature, TNAS, and the American Journal of Sociology. Also, her book, The Simple Art of Voting, has received significant acclaim from the Italian Political Science Association. Her forthcoming book, Partisan Misfits, investigates the demographic and social network bases of partisanship in American public opinion. And today she'll be talking about social network heterogeneity in the era of partisan politics. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Baldassarri.
So thanks so much. This has been a very exciting day for me, and please feel free to jump in and ask questions. It keeps me awake, and hopefully the conversation a bit more interesting for everybody. So it's the first time I present some of this work on the role that social network heterogeneity plays in the current era of very polarized partisan politics in the United States. It doesn't need a lot of explanation to observe that it makes quite a difference whether we are living in a society in which people cut across in terms of like social relationships between the main divisive lines, including politics, versus a society in which people divide quite neatly into two opposite camps. And indeed, there has been quite a bit of research arguing that politically heterogeneous social networks have a role of buffering against political extremism. Exposure to politically heterogeneous discussions has been argued favors moderation and tends to prevent people from moving to the extremes. This has been observational research, but there is also quite high quality data following people over time during campaigns or in more extended periods of time. Exposure to heterogeneous discussions also tends to promote understanding of alternative viewpoints and therefore some sort of political tolerance. And there is some scant evidence that it might also lower partisan hostility. These alleged virtues of heterogeneous social networks are probably even more important in a historical moment like today, where partisan politics in the US is quite divided. And the heterogeneous social networks might actually end up playing an even more crucial role in limiting the level of political contentions and conflict. However, exactly because we are in a very divided era when it comes to political discussions, it is also possible that in this very divisive climate, conversations with outparty members might no longer have this function of leading to greater understanding and moderation. And more importantly, it has been kind of hinted by a few people that individuals might be avoiding those very same heterogeneous discussions that have the potential to reduce animosity. People might be withdrawing from relationships with people from the other party. People might be withdrawing from discussing political topics with out-party members. In both cases, this actually might lead to some sort of self-sustaining dynamic that doesn't look quite prone to promote political conversations. So essentially, if citizens are indeed avoiding out-party members, these actually might end up making their networks even more homogeneous. And as a consequence, this might increase their animosity toward outparty members, making it even more difficult to create ties with the output. So this has led me to come up with sort of a little bit of the new research agenda in which I asked two intertwined questions. One is whether political partisanship does indeed lead to the formation of homogeneous political relationships. And if heterogeneous social networks do actually have this role of inoculating against partisan animosity. And these two questions need to be studied together in order to understand in which direction society might be going. Now, before getting to the core of the research, which is quite micro, I want to take a step back and put on the table a few facts and general findings that have been accumulating over the last 40 years in various trends of studies of American politics. The first has to do with the origin of the current levels of political polarization, which has mostly to do with elite partisanship. And the second is what consequences this great division between parties has had on the mass public. And finally, I'm going to throw there a few considerations about political homophily in social networks and how things might have changed. First of all, how did we get there? So you probably are familiar with these graphs. Essentially, party and Congress have become more divided over time. This is the distribution of the political ideology over 20 years from the 70s to 2011. There is no overlap between Congress representatives anymore. And this process started in the early 70s, in which both political parties have moved farther apart. And the classical way of functioning that was characterizing Congress till then by partisanship started to decline quite heavily. The first process had to do with the macrostructural realignment of the southern states, which has led to a consistent movement of the Republican Party toward more conservative positions and to a systematic replacement of moderate representatives by new cohorts of more extreme members of Congress. And this has been pretty visible over the years, starting in the 80s and then heavily in the 90s for the Republican Party, but the similar process of self-selection and replacement of congressmen by people who are more extreme than those that left has been continuing over time, leading to a very divided political elite. This is compounded with processes of polarization that have characterized interest groups, political activists, and donors. In all three groups, we have seen them becoming more extreme in their positions in a era in which they have also become more influential, especially interest groups and donors have really become what drives most of party agendas in the last 40 years, partly due to the increased cost of campaigns and the growth of single issue interest groups. And then there was a dynamic of mutual reinforcement between party elites that have become more extreme and activists. So we did see quite early on, starting in the 90s, activists becoming more extreme, and those are the voices from below that politicians hear the most, and therefore there was a constant feedback loop between these two types of actors. And the final layer to the story is the role that media fragmentation, negative advertising, and the partisan information strategies have played in feeding individuals constantly information about the current political climate as a climate characterized by two extreme and very different parties and set of voters. Now, in all of this, for a while people have been asking what happened in public opinion. And the debate started in the 90s, has gone on for a while, but the quite general agreement is that if we consider the population as a whole, American citizens, and we ask whether their opinions have become more extreme in terms of moving from a distribution of moderate opinions on a bunch of issues to a bimodal distribution, the answer is there is nothing going on in that domain. So for instance, if you take this very recent analysis of the evolution of the distribution of preferences in the population over time from the late 80s to early 2010 in three major issue domains, economic, civil rights, and moral, you see that the shape of this curve has not changed, it's not becoming more bimodal in any respect. What has happened in the large population is a very different process, which has been labeled in very different ways, but there is some sort of agreement that essentially we have observed the process of partisan sorting, where Democrats and Republicans have started have sorted along partisan lines on a quite widespread set of issues. And what has happened is that parties themselves have become more distinct and started to send more clear messages. People have received these messages and they were better at sorting themselves between camps. This is visible in terms of trends in correlation with respect to a bunch of economic issues. Here I'm plotting just a trend on federal spending for health insurance. And back in the 70s, essentially the correlation was 0.2 between supporting health insurance spending and being a Democrat. It goes up like 0.1, let's say 10% more in a 20 years period, 30 years period. If we look at the trend on abortion, the trend is even more telling. So back in the 70s, the correlation between support of abortion and being a Democrat was actually below zero, meaning if you knew that someone was against abortion, you were better off guessing that this person was a Democrat than this person being a Republican. If fast forward 30 years, 2004, you have like a 20% more chances to guess that someone is a Democrat if this person is in favor of women's choice. So the distribution of preferences on a bunch of issues, these analyses are usually carried out on a large set of issues, has not changed in terms of the distribution, but people have sorted. And another way of looking at this is the following graph. This summarizes results for economic issues, civil rights issues, moral issues, and even foreign policy. And what you see is that essentially among Democrats, the proportion of people that identify with liberal positions on economic issues goes up, Republicans goes down, so there is this like constant division. Similar process with moral issues, with a general trend that actually goes toward more progressivism, but much faster among them. So essentially, this process is the one thing that has really characterized American politics with respect to public opinion. And notice, this started later on, started like in the 90s, became very visible in the 2000s, not before. And in that sense, we all believe this is a consequence of the elite becoming more divided rather than the other way around. This process in itself, however, has also triggered something else that has become very interesting for many scholars in the last few years, which is being called affective polarization, which is the level of animosity across party lines. And this animosity apparently has increased. This is a classical graph that people have shown multiple times, showing the response in terms of warmth feeling on the feeling thermometer for the in party, which is stable over time, and for the out party. So for the Republicans, is the Democrat, and the other way around. And what we do see is that essentially around 2000 and a bit later, 2010, there was a big drop in warm feeling toward members of the opposite party. This is all going on. There is not much support of an increase in support for in-group. Other measures, mainly attitudinal in terms of like traits, in terms of trust toward members of the out group, in terms of social distance from out party members, they all suggest the same thing. Around 2000, 2010, there was like a greater increase in self-reported animosity. How does this come from? So the major reason is probably that the moment in which parties have become more divided, they have become also more distinguishable and more coherent internally. This greater ideological distance between the parties have made supporters really identify themselves with their party and actually start like identifying the opposite party as something very different. This has also been triggered even more strongly by the misperception of outparty. So on the one hand, the two parties have become like more different, but then the perception of the outparty is even more markedly different. And this is actually the consequence of media representation and negative campaigning. All these dynamics have exacerbated the perceived distance between parties and has constantly promoted stereotypical views. So right now, there are surveys suggesting that when Democrats are asked what proportion of Republicans make more than 250K, the answer is 30%. The actual real answer in the population is 3%. If you ask Republicans what proportion of Democrats are gay or lesbians, they would say something like 40% or 20%. It varies, but it's like numbers that are off compared to what the actual proportion of these demographics in the population. And then this misperception, as I mentioned, has increased the level of animosity toward the outparty. The third element is that in this process, parties have started to divide not only on the classical civil rights and economic issues, but they have started also to really trade on moral, on their moral domain. And the moral domain might actually have triggered an extension of the political conflict to a domain that is more contentious, that really like triggers reactions that are more rooted in values and emotions. All these dynamics have led many people to describe the current process as a process that has taken the form of partisan identification. So individuals are identifying with the two parties, and this has triggered an us versus them type of psychological dynamic that has triggered feelings of anger and fear toward the other party. So we moved from sort of hostility that was rooted in differences about policies to an hostility that is rooted in emotional reactions. Now, I, for a while, kind of ignored a bit this literature, in the sense that I'm not coming here to tell you emotions don't matter or animosity doesn't matter, but I sort of thought of it as the byproduct of other processes. And being Italian, I raised up in a cultural and political context where it was totally normal for parties to hate each other. The communists, the democratic Christians, like their animosity there was way higher than you can think of what's going on here. And at the same time, the country was functional or dysfunctional, whatever it is, but not really because of this animosity. However, there are a couple of things that made me think about this process a bit more seriously. And one is that some studies started to show that indeed, while it is true that affective polarization is mostly the byproduct of our dynamics, and also like partisanship and divisions on policies, there seems to be some evidence that this negative outlook on the other party has affected the position that people took on new issues, in particular on health response to COVID-19. And it was striking because this was not only about attitudes, but also behavior. So based on partly animosity and compounded with which media people were watching, some people made health decisions that were consequential for their own life and the life of their own people that actually could have been probably different if the level of animosity in the public discourse wasn't the one we had experienced in the last few years. The other thing that made me really stop and think is a bunch of studies that are showing that this interparty animosity might be affecting the way in which people build their social relationships. Some studies have started to show that political partisanship seems to influence the way in which we select friends and romantic partners, roommates, business partners. However, there is also research that is showing that this is not really affecting, for instance, residential mobility or other dynamics. Most of this research is based on experiments like this one, which are called conjoined experiments, in which individuals are put in front of some sort of hypothetical situation in which they are asked to think about, in this case, choosing a roommate, and they are presented with two alternatives and a series of characteristics of this individual potential roommate, some habits, they prefer red time, music preferences, and partisan affiliation. And then, like, through this systematic comparison of these profiles, we can estimate the extent to which partisan affiliation exerts an effect in the choice of, in this case, a roommate, net of all the other factors. These actually results made me stop with it because, and some of the studies social networks, I do know, and we have always known, that there is a certain degree of political homophily in social networks. There has always been. People tend to flock together with birds of a feather, meaning people like them. However, political homophily, the fact that Democrats were disproportionately associating with Democrats and Republicans with the Republicans, have always been explained as the byproduct, as the consequence of a social selection process that was based on other characteristics, usually socio-demographic characteristics, that are correlated with partisanship, but are not partisanship. So the fact that people associate with people that are similar to them in terms of race, income, religiosity, levels of education, the places they live, these actually leads to homophily in social relations and produces also political homophily. However, if this political homophily is produced sort of on the basis of socio-demographic associations, this in itself might not lead to extreme political homophily. Because essentially most people, especially in complex societies, carry multiple identities, most of them which are cross-cutting, and therefore very much be likely to be exposed to people across political boundaries. This instead won't happen if we are in a context in which people end up voting primarily based on partisanship, because this would actually inevitably lead to partisan homophily, especially in a two-party system. This is because even the people who would actually prefer to choose their friends and acquaintances on the basis of some other characteristics would be forced to conform to a world in which people are splitting on the basis of their shorts or their red and blue shorts. Okay. Now, the little we know about social networks and how people associate leads me to believe that, in general, the structural constraints that determine our lives might limit the extent to which we can literally base our choices on partisanship. This might actually be quite easy to do when we discuss the few close friends people have. But when we actually start like thinking about social networks in terms of acquaintances, people you meet at work, meet in leisure activities, meet in like through other type of social engagements, these networks might still retain a certain level of heterogeneity. But this is actually a plausible research question. And so I started out this little data collection by setting a very little goal, which was to essentially get a sense of the political heterogeneity of social networks nowadays, both collecting data on close ties, close discussion networks, which is the traditional ways in which people actually measure the heterogeneity of discussion networks, but also collecting data on acquaintance networks, the broader set of relationships people are embedded in. Relationships that might not lead necessarily to political conversations, but might nonetheless lead to contact with people from different parties. This next step is to come up with a more formal test or set of tests in order to understand whether it is indeed the case that people rely on partisanships when they decide who to interact with. And finally, I'm going back to the original idea that the heterogeneous social networks had this role of buffering against partisan animosity, and try to test it with current data. Testing in particular two types of mechanisms. One is the one that we quite know well, and it's usually happening through close ties and in political discussions. And this idea of hearing the other side. People actually might reduce their level of animosity or being more able to accept moderate views because they had conversations and come to understand other people. But the second mechanism that is less investigated so far, but might actually become quite relevant in the current historical period, is that through acquaintances, through exposure to a general public, we might actually be learning to see the other side and correct the misperceptions we have about the members of the other group. So maybe if we know enough Republicans, we won't actually estimate that 40% of them make more than 250K. That's the basic idea. So what I set out to do was to start with a two-wave data collection, and I'm going to present the results from the first wave and the idea of the second wave, which is coming up soon, on an online sample of around 3,000 respondents, which is quite representative of the American population. The first data way in which we collect data about networks is this classic name generator that most people use, in which people thought we want to learn about your pros and contacts. If you look back on the last 6 months, with whom did you discuss important things? So people are asked to list up to 5 people with whom they discussed the important things, not politics necessarily, but important things. And then they were asked to name or give the initials of these individuals. And this question was followed by questions about the demographics and the partisanship of this person they talked to. And these data reports around 40% of respondents that have at least one outparty close tie, and it's in line with other data that has been collected recently. And this is a question that has been out there for a good 30 years. When people look at the trend over time in the proportion of out-party members reported, there is not much difference. And what has been found is that around elections, especially contentious elections, people tend to shrink their networks and report fewer out-group members. But then, in periods in which there is not such a contentious political climate, they go back to relatively heterogeneous close ties. The second set of the second measure is an acquaintance network. This is quite new. It's a little adjustment of something that was done in the past. And in this case, we explicitly tell people we want to focus on their acquaintances as well to think about the people that they are acquainted with, meaning that you know their name and stop and talk at least for a moment if you run into the person on the street or a moment. And we ask them to name how many of them are Republican. And then the second set of questions, how many are Democrat? We start from a cut point, less than 10, more than 10. And then for each response, we have other cut points. And in this case, we create a scale that essentially reports the probability of the proportion of ties, of acquaintance ties that are in parties versus out party. And in this context, we do find that the acquaintance networks is on average constituted by 40% of all partisans, and only 8% respondents say that they don't know any member of the other party. The most interesting thing from this little descriptive exercise is to look at how these two types of networks combine. So there is, of course, a correlation. So people who tend to have homogeneous acquaintance networks also tend not to report any outgroup member in their close ties networks. However, what we find here, and then I explain what this graph shows, what we find here is that there is a fair amount of respondents in homogeneous close networks that don't have any close discussion person that is of the outgroup, but nonetheless have some acquaintances that are from the other party. So essentially here we have the proportion of people with out-partisan acquaintances. Here are the people with no out-partisan acquaintances. Here people who report an evenly split network. And here I'm showing the data in terms of proportion for people who report homogeneous close networks. So people who report in black, no close ties with out-party members, and people who report at least one out-party member. And what you see is that among the blacks that report not having any close tie with the other party, there is a fair amount of exposure to the other party through acquaintance networks. I see your hand there.
Yeah, I think you invited questions, right?
Sure, more than welcome. Yes.
A couple of slides ago, you mentioned that when you were talking about the close network, that during election periods, it becomes more homogenous. Just wondering if the mechanism there has been fleshed out to explain why that is, because what it makes me think of is, in some ways, and it's just an intuition, but the last several years where these kinds of polarization issues have become more salient are we're always living in an election period. And so I'm wondering, what is the functionality of that shift towards homogeneity? Is it functional? And does that explain these kinds of time course drifts that we seem to be doing?
That's a great question. So essentially the explanation there has been the following. It's quite convincing. There is a few papers by B.K. Lee and Peter Berman together and separately. And the explanation there is the following. One has to do with the nature of the question. The question asked about important matters. Around politics, important matters are disproportionately political matters. There is a bunch of people who don't want to talk about politics, so the networks shrink, especially shrinks in terms of the number of outgroup members. So that's one explanation. The other, more general, that has been documented, I also have a little contribution there, is that people systematically tend to avoid conflict. And this is quite a paradox, but by avoiding conflict, we don't discuss topics that might actually be contentious. And this creates not only homogeneous networks, but also emphasizes the perception of homogeneous networks, in the sense that we might actually be in the presence of out-party members, or at least in the presence of people who are maybe of our same party, but have different opinions on some issues. But we never go there, we never discuss that. And I had a series of surveys in which we asked to report discussion partners exactly like this, and then we got into details of what do you discuss about. We asked about 5 salient issues, and we found out that people tend to not discuss the issues they anticipate the other person will disagree with them about. So there is this component of systematically withdrawing from conflict. Selective disclosure, if you want. So there is a real thing, but there is also a sort of self censoring that is done in order to maintain peace, but has the actual global effect of creating polarized feeling and a real also set of experiences. So that's what's going on here in 3D. Okay, so essentially this is very descriptive, but it's telling us we have 2 different types of networks, close ties and acquaintanceships. They might have different roles. They are related, but these acquaintance networks seem to actually step in and provide exposure to group members, even for people who have very homogeneous close ties. Now, the next step is to see whether, in the process of selecting discussion partners, people indeed do decide to avoid people from the other party. So they rely on partisanship as a criteria to select possible friends or acquaintances. So here we did a little exercise in which we asked our participants to choose an office mate. So we told them that there was the office space in their company was going through a reorganization, and the person had the opportunity to select an office mate with whom they'd be sharing the office every day. And then we asked them to think about the aspects of this person that are important to you. Tell us the characteristics of the person you'd like to know more about before making a choice, before saying, I want to be with this office mate or this other office mate. And instead of giving them a bunch of information, first of all, we just had an open question. We asked them, like, just write in a few words, tell us what is relevant in this choice. And in open-ended responses, we had like less than 4% of respondents mention politics of any version of it. Less than 4%. And this was actually quite striking because the set of questions right before were about political partisanship, self-identification in terms of ideology and party. So like partisanship was silly. But nonetheless, we have this result in open-ended question. If you're curious about what they said, they go from like not as loud, not loud, not annoying, someone who takes shower, habits, interests, I like and dislike. The person should like the music, don't eat in the office. I don't want someone who's lazy. I don't want a go-getter. So like they explained a few things. Several people wanted an old lady for some reason, but politics never comes up. Next step, we actually do something slightly more structured, and we still are after an office mate, and we present these respondents with pairs of characteristics of potential office mates. And we show each respondent 6 of them. And every time the respondent has to tell us which aspect is more important in deciding whether they like this person or not. And for instance, we say, which of the following characteristics is more important to you? Their job experience, or whether they like an occasional drink, whether they vote Republican or Democrat, or whether they have kids, and so on and so forth. This allows us to actually assess through these pairwise comparisons what is the relevance of this information. What we found is this. I apologize for if you cannot read the thing very well, but essentially we found that some characteristics like work ethic, the personality, the cleanliness, the job experience are picked a lot. Like in all around 90% of the comparisons, these things come up. These are the things that they prefer over anything else. Of course, the pairwise comparison were randomized, so you can just rely on this type of analysis. And then you go down, you have talkativeness, role in the company, whether these people don't take calls at the desk, and then some socio-demographics, education, age, whether we bring pets to the office and so on. Guess where partisanship is? Down here. Like it's super no relevant. It's just like before nationality and race and things. Everything else seems to be more relevant for our respondents. And this actually is, if you zoom in and we ask whether the relevance varies on the basis of the network composition of our respondents, we find the following results. So here we are literally zooming in on one result. The extent to which people care about whether a person is a Republican or a Democrat, as a function of whether individuals have heterogeneous or homogeneous close networks, okay? And we do see that essentially people who are embedded in homogeneous networks do give to partisanship slightly more importance, but we are still in the domain of very low relevance. And note, and the same thing happens with acquaintance networks. Note one thing, talking about politics is accurate. So essentially, whether the person talks about politics is quite relevant, but not their partisanship. They probably don't want people who talk about politics. It's not something that is expected in a office environment.
Is there a difference between homogeneous network Democrats and homogeneous network Republicans?
Not much. And even if you split it by Democrat and Republican, we don't have a difference, and there is no difference in the homogeneity. Next, we move to a different exercise, which is much more similar to the conjoint. It's a conjoint experiment, like the experiment that the people before us have run. Okay. Remember when I showed you the roommate choice? Okay. So in this case, we show a series of pair profiles in which one of the characteristics is partisanship. So this is the way they were presented to our respondents. We have gender, religion, partisanship, race, eating habits, and etiquette. And then people have to choose which of them they prefer. Now, when you actually put the question in these terms, what we do find, I'm going to walk through the results because they're a bit slightly more complicated to read. What we do find is that when you do provide information about whether a person is a Republican or a Democrat, that information really has leverage and people use it. Okay, so here I'm showing results from this conjoint experiment, and essentially every result has to be interpreted as the extent to which this information, for instance, whether a person is a male or a female, changes people's choice net of all the rest. And we do find that both among Democrats, which is the blue, and Republicans, there is slightly preference for female. Republicans like religious people a bit more, but the big difference is here. So the comparison term is a strong Democrat, and the Democrats definitely prefer a Democrat, whether a moderate or a strong, over any form of Republican, and the other way around. So the Republicans prefer a moderate Democrat over a strong Democrat, but they definitely very much prefer Republican, both moderate or strong. So essentially what we do observe here is that if provided with information, people are really like relying on it. So if I'm asked the question whether partisanship does affect the way in which people choose their interaction partners, my answer is that political partisanship is definitely not at the top of people's mind. And when they think about like forming new relationships, they do consider a bunch of other aspects. However, partisanship doesn't become relevant if people are provided this information, especially when it's provided in settings where information is scarce. If all I tell you is that this person is Republican and is 50 years old and a female, like I am really giving you little besides that one information, and you run on it. So this is quite relevant because it sort of brings up the importance of displays or not displaying partisanship at the beginning of potential social relationships. And unless people wear politics up their sleeves, political partisanship has an inevitable sorting. But things might change, and like choices, like for instance, some dating sites choosing to ask and report partisanship might really induce greater social selection along this line. So like these features of a built environment, as some sociologists put it, do affect how we choose each other or not choose each other. Yes?
So is it possible that people do use political
party affiliation in making a choice, but they are unwilling to admit that they're using that information. So as an analogy, I imagine that if you ask college undergraduates, what's the best characteristic of their mate, say spouse or boyfriend, girlfriend, they may not necessarily admit that they look into wealth of the household. They're going to say that, or handsome, or something like this. However, if you provide this wealth information in the disguise of a whole bunch of things that they can use as a cover, and then they say, "Oh yeah, I love is wonderful," except they end up choosing wealthy family. Is this analogous, or something else is going on?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's as analogous in the sense that the reason people might lie when you put the question in those terms is because they know there is a social norm about not sort of displaying interest, romantic interest in terms of like financial gain, at least like in the current society. The other thing is that my guess is that if you were to ask that question directly to a bunch of Americans, they would actually rate wealth up there. It wouldn't be the first, but it would be much higher than where partisanship was here. So like they might like, but they won't like as much as they like here. The last thing is that so the only thing is like there is no such a strong stereotype against by using partisanship. In fact, in certain settings, it's actually expected that you manifest your views. The other thing is that wealth and well, is actually more relevant in some domains than others, the same way in which partisanship is, but it is something that cannot be avoided. The partisanship, as some of these people are showing, is fully avoidable by not talking about it.
Yeah, I was thinking more, well, wealth analogy may be a little bit misleading. What I was thinking about is that if you interact only with those people who share the same political orientation, you end up getting a lot of support to your own position. But this whole endeavor can backfire and compromise if you admit to yourself that you are self-selecting your friends so that your friends end up supporting your political view. For this endeavor to work out, you have to psychologically hide from your view that you selected. So I was wondering if people might end up choosing somebody similar, except they are unwilling to admit that choice. And that's possible when you provide some alternative explanation for your selection.
I still don't understand why that won't show up in the pairwise comparison, and instead it will show up in the conjoint. So if your reasoning was indeed explaining the results, we would also see that self-censoring in this one, right? But here we don't see the self-censoring. So it doesn't like, there is like this attempt at sort of camouflaging what your choice is about, either because it's normative, not acceptable, or because it makes you feel good only if you tell yourself that's not the case, that you're choosing your friends on the basis of, for example, we will see it here because it's really a very similar task. The point is like, there is something very different going on, which is that once the information is given, cannot be taken away. So if I ask you, do you want to know whether this person is Republican or a Democrat, over knowing whether the person picks his nose in the office, you'll go for the nose. But if I tell you this person is Republican, you can't get that out of your head. Especially since you have not met the person, you have no clue who this person is. So you don't have any way to relate to these individuals. And so the only thing you can do is just to imagine the worst, or the Democrat if you're a Republican. Okay, so that's actually what is probably going on here. Hand?
I have two questions,
Yes.
but I don't have to, if you have more you want to get through, you
It's
can do
okay,
it.
it's okay. I can
It's okay.
talk about
Okay, can you go back just forward to that last slide you were on about partisan,
it. This one, this one,
no, where were you just before you went back? It was about
Oh, yeah,
affecting,
this one.
this
The-
one, yes. Okay, so two questions. So first of all, I wonder about the dynamism of like the circumstances under which we're looking at the friendship formation or acquaintance formation process and the way in which these factors play into it. If it's back in the midst of an election, I might be differentially sensitive more sensitive to some of these issues in forming acquaintances than I am if it's during less turbulent times. And so like the data earlier suggests that those dynamics may play a powerful role in these processes. So just wondering if that's essentially a moderator. That's a
Yeah.
question one. I'll leave that there and then I'll go to the next one.
Can I answer this?
Yeah, go.
So this was a final design which we want, like this was fielded during, like in the 3 days going up to the midterm elections. So we wanted to exploit exactly that peak of heightened political debate last fall. We also wanted to do a bunch of stuff. So the results you're seeing are results from a situation in which we stuck with deck against ourselves, if you want, in the sense that if it's not relevant there, it might not be relevant. But the idea is also to run on the same sample, similar study in a period in which there is less of focus on politics. It's hard to predict when, but you might be in a month or two. And so like we can also take into account the periodicity effect, which is however not big. So you need to be really large data to show that. So there is also, for instance, this paper that tracked people's travels back to home for Thanksgiving using like cellular data. And they showed that people were less likely to go back in contentious elections when they were traveling to a place that was differently politically from the place they were living. And if they were to travel, they would stay less at the Thanksgiving dinner. So that's the one type of like large data set that allows you to leverage these effects of like contentious, non-contentious. Here, it won't be probably big. Yeah. Second question.
So the second question, and you may have addressed this, so just tell me if you did, but I'm thinking about the distinction between concreteness and abstractness and how that plays into the acquaintance or friendship formation process. So Yakov Trope, who colleague of yours in psychology, studied this a lot at NYU. And it strikes me that there are two different conditions under which these friendships form. So part of it is very cognitive, thinking abstractly about what my goals are like or what are the things that I care about, and friends, what kinds of qualities do they have? So if I'm hiring someone and I get a personal statement, I can like try to see if I'm aligning with someone I'm trying to hire into my lab. That's one instance in which a lot of friendships or acquaintances are formed. But then there are events like this where I just bump into someone and we start talking and we're not advertising our views on things. And it strikes me that a different calculus may be involved in that more concrete exchange than the more abstract, where we're seeing different qualities of an individual and making those kinds of abstract judgments.
So there is a little bit of scholarship in sociology about how social networks are formed, and there's this basic idea of foci, of interaction. So essentially, people like are more likely to meet and form friendships and marry or fight or whatever with others around context, which could be the workplace, which could be leisure activity, which could be so there is this dynamic which in itself introduces structure in how the opportunities of encounter unfolds. So there is almost never randomness. There are some settings that are more structured than others. But I remember this finding where they were saying that essentially Around 50% of people find their spouse in college, and a good chunk of these people have met that person in the first few weeks of college experience. Of course, that makes a lot of sense. That's the moment in which you have no friends, so that's the moment in which you pile up. And so, the classes you take, the clubs you join, those few sort of random decisions do actually unfold in a way that is very hard to anticipate. So there is a dynamic that sociologists actually describe as very likely to impose structure. All this story about romantic love has to do with ending up in the same college setting. So, you see how the structure works behind your back. And that's why I was kind of a bit skeptical of these papers that were simply showing a conjoint framework and just putting everything there on your face and pretending this is an actual choice. So the way in which sociologists go at this is to say there is all structure and then we have some leverage. And in some contexts we have more leverage. Close friendships, I can really decide to get rid of those I don't like. Co-workers have to live with them. In most cases. So that's why, but your point is actually important because right now we are also moving into a way of determining interactions. I made the example of a dating app, but you can also think about how to select business partners in an economy that is much more sort of based on one-to-one relationships, whether you are hiring a computer programmer or a plumber. And in all these contexts, how you pick these people, whether you pick them on the basis of their skills, their rating, their picture, or their politics, because the information that is provided to you conveys or doesn't convey this information is relevant. So it's an open question. That's why I sort of end up here saying, unless people wear politics up their sleeves, unless they do decide, or the structure, the dating side makes it necessary to make that public, the tendency is not to go there as a first thing, but it can change if we are forced to. Okay, so this is for the question about how partisanship does influence the formation of social relationships. The last part, which is a bit faster, is going back to the question about whether heterogeneous social networks do have this role of buffering against partisan animosity. As I mentioned, there is a fair amount of research in the past showing that this seems to be the case. So network partisanship, network a bunch of other things. If you are in a network that is heterogeneous, you are less likely you're more likely to be moderate, you're less likely to move to extremes, you're more likely to be accepting of alternative views. I am simply looking, first of all, at the correlation between the measures of network heterogeneity, both ties and acquaintanceship, with some classical measures of affective polarization. The one that I'm going to present is an index of partisan animosity that Jamie Druckmann has been using for a while and seems to have gathered a bit of consensus. There is the feeling thermometer questions, a bunch of trait evaluations about the outparty members, whether they are intelligent, whether they are disappointing, and so on. And then there are some trust items, whether people can members of the outparty can be trusted most of the time. And so on. This is just an index. But then I did something that I believe was slightly more meaningful because behavioral and because it had some stake. Higher stakes in terms of thinking about dinner. Higher stakes in terms of the cost of making decision, and it's a logic puzzle. I'm starting from this second one. So the logic puzzle goes like this. Our participants are told that they are going to do this activity with another person. And it's a logic puzzle, quite easy to solve. And if they both solve this puzzle, they are credited a certain amount, which is a bit less of $1. Then they're gonna give the option to choose between two profiles, okay? And they have to choose who they want to do this logic task with, okay? And one person is John, who works in a supermarket, is 43 years old, likes to swim, and is a Democrat. So this one is always an in-party member. And the second one, James, is an engineer, 41, likes to go on walks, and is a Democrat in this case. So in all this, the only information that is relevant is that this guy is an engineer, so probably slightly better chances of getting the logic puzzle right. Okay, so we expect that in this context, people would actually end up choosing this version. This is our control group. Our treatment group gets a slightly different version. The first person is still an in-party member, but the other person is an out-party member. So this time, in order to get the engineer, you also have to go with an out-party member. So we are gonna like see whether people are willing to pick an out-party member in order to maximize their chances of getting this puzzle right and make some money, or if they actually are willing to give up those economic gains in order to stick with the in-party. And the results are the following. So I'm gonna show the main effect. So essentially, when you have a situation in which both people are in party, both Democrats or both Republicans, you do have something like this, like the engineer is, essentially the engineer is an out-party member, is actually 30% less likely to be chosen compared to a situation in which the engineer is an in-party member. However, we do have a difference. If we look at people who have homogeneous versus heterogeneous acquaintances. So people embedded in heterogeneous acquaintances are totally okay, are much more okay going with the engineer, even if it's now out-party member, than people who are stuck with homogeneous acquaintances. And the same trend we find when we look at close ties, although the difference here is not significant. So in this case, we do show a relationship between like network heterogeneity and willingness to like sort of give a chance to members of the other party. Here I'm going to show the results in terms of correlation between network heterogeneity and the classical index of affective polarization, the one I mentioned before, with the thermometer and so on. And here we do have, again, something similar where people who have acquaintance, heterogeneous acquaintance networks tend to net of everything else, partisanship, interest in politics, and so on, versus demographics, they tend to have a slightly better opinion of the outparty, okay? And similar effect for people who are heterogeneous close ties. Now, in the case of close ties, we will also be able to dig a bit into the mechanisms that might actually explain why having heterogeneous networks might lead to greater acceptance. We asked, when people listed these out-party discussion partners, we asked them, when you discuss with this person, do you agree or disagree with the statement that when I discuss with this person, I understand them? And people who claim that they understand this person tend to be more accepting of out-party members. Same when we ask whether they end up like disagreeing. People who agree after a conversation, they also end up having a more positive view of the out-party in general. So the idea here is that there is some little evidence of the idea that essentially the way in which close ties discussion networks work is through facilitating the understanding of the other side, like hearing the other side. I don't have yet a proof for the mechanism that I believe is happening with respect to the acquaintance ties. I mentioned before, I believe that what acquaintance ties do is to reduce misperceptions. Like the more outgroup members you see in real life, the more you realize they are people and very much in most cases like you. So you're less likely to stereotype them in a very extreme and negative ways. So in the next wave, we are going to have a battery of questions about misperceptions, and we are going to see whether there is a correlation there between heterogeneity and misperceptions. Yes?
So, look, about misperception.
Yes.
Have you seen, it's Aller and Sud, right? That's the partisan stereotypes.
Yes,
Is there one like that for, say, religious groups? So so if I'm reading the thing and I think, well, I have to choose my roommate, they're Republican, that means they're rich, they're straight, et cetera, et cetera. When I read religious or not religious in your conjoint, are there stereotypes that appeal there? And then relatedly, have you seen any recent stuff where it's stereotypes of intelligence for in-party versus out-party?
Intelligence, as far as I recall, no. I think I've seen something which they asked misperceptions about the proportion of conservative evangelicals. Or I might have dreamt of it, but I think that there is. I think there is.
Studies are focused on politics, right? And people have clear stereotypes of people, political sets, and then we do a conjoint with politics in it. I'm just sort of wondering if there's something you could throw in that would also have stereotypes, right? And so that, oh, well, now they're moving. Like, I don't have a stereotype of people who eat dinner at lunch at their table. Yeah. Or not even kind of stereotypical, but sort of like, oh, now that you've given me, I have strong stereotypes about people from Georgia versus people from Philadelphia, and now I'm going to decide based on that rather than the politics, because I find that stereotype to be more informative than the political one.
Okay. I haven't seen that. Remember, like, people doing this experiments didn't want to have the different results. So the removal of paper, but actually does show that there is no partisan effect in selecting where to live. Does exactly that. Like, it throws in even in the conjoint, it throws in the characteristics that turn out to be on top, among the most important, and in fact, partisanship. Once you consider the price, public transportation, and the quality of schools, everything else is not relevant. So, like, the point is, like, how you build these conjoints in terms of things are, it's very much what you find as a result. And that's why I started slowly and said, okay, let's see what people come up with, what they would like to know. And then let's see what's the relative importance and so on. So that, yes. Intelligence have never, I know there is some literature on intelligence dehumanization and so on, so there might be also some. So the other thing that we want to do with the panel is to do some sort of a soft, if you want, manipulation of the network. So I'm a sociologist. I believe in network. I don't feel like I can manipulate networks. We can change the salience, but I can't really change ties in a study. But I can see whether people change the composition of their networks over time, and this happens. Some studies have done it, and if, especially in the acquaintance domain, where we have the suspect is quite independent of partisanship in itself, and whether that change is related with the buffering effect of heterogeneity on partisan animosity. So these are the two things that I want to achieve with the second wave. There are a few others, but that's it. Okay, so a few words at the end. The story is quite simple. When I saw this New Yorker cover, it was July 4th. It was a cover for July 4th. As a foreigner, immigrant, which I am, I thought, oh, cool, they are showing essentially that Americans are the same. Like, I saw these pictures, and the similarities are striking. And then I did see the title that the author gave it. It was House Divided. So the meaning that the person who drew this wanted to convey was like the little differences, which essentially, to me, sum up to the way in which they keep the garden order and discipline on one side and so on, and some of the signs, like Black Lives Matters, and backward and so on. So in my view, there was not a lot of difference in the understanding of the person who view this was really about the division. And my take on the research I've done is really that we can make of this exactly the same, in the same way, in the sense that my take is that there is no strong signs of partisanship becoming a divisive element right now in the mind of people. And there is still an effect of, in terms of buffering against animosity that heterogeneous social relationship play. But one thing that I actually came to realize is that the display of partisanship might be some sort of double-edged sword, in the sense that on the one hand, it might serve to reduce misperceptions. The more outparty members I see, the more I realize we are seeing. However, it might also discourage interaction, exactly for the findings that we had in the conjoint, where like if I put partisanship like right there in front of you, the first time even before we meet, that might preclude the possibility of an encounter. So in some ways, it speaks to my understanding of how social relationships used to unfold in social life, which were really based on similarities, based on like sociodemographics and passions and values and so on, but then actually sort of like also consolidate around partisanship, but are not driven by it. And this is, I believe, what is the beauty of democratic regimes, which is that people can go about their lives without constantly have to worry about politics. And instead, like societies end up like splitting when individuals, where politics are perceived, when political identities become like an organizing principle of social life in order to get a job or a roommate or form a soccer team. So this is like how I think of this. And I think we are still in a world in which people are more similar than different, but definitely what is playing a big role in how we are going to move forward is whether this constant messaging from the top, elite media, interest groups, is going to constantly highlight the differences rather than the commonalities. And so far, it has already done something. People are slow, thank God. They are not really picking up at the pace in which parties are divided, but this is my reading of the story so far. Thank you.
I think it's fascinating, this huge difference you find in the different ways you've measured or given people the opportunity to show whether party matters. But it just struck me, given this talk, that as people come to recognize, I mean, you said, and I think I know the data you're talking about, it's correct, that it seems like there's no stigma associated with saying, I don't like Republicans if I'm a Democrat, or I don't like Democrats if I'm a Republican. That sounds right to me. I know that I've seen data like that. But what if, as partisanship becomes more clearly an identity and not just a set of policy views, which we may or may not agree with, then it's also stigmatized for us to express that we don't like those people. And then the differences between these two types of measures you've used become smaller. It's more about the expression. I don't know if it's the same as Shinobu's point, but it might be that you just are not allowed to say, you're not allowed to offer this as a reason why you don't like people anymore. But in the conjoint, it's just one of 20 things. And so you have 19 reasons you never have to tell the researcher this is the one that matters. You're just making choices, and there's 19 other reasons you could have chosen, and it'll never be revealed until you do the data analysis afterwards. That on average everyone's deciding on party, and it's not surprising then that the things they don't talk about in the open-ended or in the other tests that you gave is race and party. These are the ones that are now becoming the most socially prohibited to raise as reasons you don't want to be around somebody. It's just a speculation, but what if that's becoming, what if over time it's becoming more stigmatized to actually say, I don't like to be around the other party?
Yeah, it's totally possible. I think it might not be as stigmatized right now just because people avoid it, and they avoid it more easily than friends because with exception of like extreme displays, like partisanship is not easy. So in some ways, the stigmatization and the sort of sanctioning of the use of stigmatizing strategies comes with how easy it is to do it, and with race is essential. Gender could be another one, but it's not anymore, at least like in some of these contexts. I think that the way out that we see from some of these surveys, and we do see some here, and we do see it somehow, for instance, when people ask the classical thing, how happy would you be if your daughter or son marries a Republican or an outparty member? And people are like much more unhappy now than in the past. But if you add, but this person is not really interested in politics, the effect goes away. So like the way in which people deal with this, I think it's withdrawing, not going down. However, you're totally right that in my also field there's a stigma. And trigger those dynamics in which people are not outspoken, they try not to display it, they try to hide it. This is how people defend, they use conjoints over other things. Well, however, life is not a conjoint. Like that, my point there was more about, and it's a question mark, is like how do potential interactions become interactions in everyday life? Is it on the basis of a complete display of these characteristics, or is it through some sort of foci encounters around shared identities and so on, and that might or might not lead to some convergence of politics? And there is really like, but that's how I think of the difference between those two exercises. The other thing is that the effect of the conjoint can also be made go away by adding things that are more relevant. We add things that were in between, like gender was in between. We didn't add anything about competence or role in the company, so like things that are really chosen 90% of the time. We don't know what is happening to that. And we didn't add interest in politics, which is another thing that might reduce it. So you might be right. I don't sense we are there yet. And the other thing is that, again, I'm Italian, so it takes a while for people to internalize norms according to which you don't display your real reasons for discrimination. So Italians are still not hiding their discriminatory behavior on the basis of race. So I doubt that Americans have already absorbed over the last few decades that it's not nice to show that you're discriminating on the basis of politics, but it's a guess. So, help.
I resonate with the idea that people won't seek out politics, but when presented to them, they'll give it away. But that actually makes me a little less optimistic about polarizing things, because not only do we find out about individuals having politics, we find out about neighborhoods having politics. I remember being driven around Columbus, Ohio, my host saying that's a Republican neighborhood, that's a Democratic neighborhood. There are colleges that are conservative and liberal, there are professions that are conservative and liberal. And so it's partisanship is thrown in our face quite a bit. It doesn't have to be about an individual per se. There was that's one question I wanted to ask. The second question I wanted to ask, you can choose whichever one to answer, is I'm intrigued with the asymmetry in the data, I think, was from the conjoint experiment, where people reacted to Republican stimuli, but not so much Democratic stimuli. And the first thought I had is that made sense to me because that's really what the media plays up. The Republicans are the main protagonists in the play of the news, not Democrats. And so naturally, that would be the party that would receive the strongest reaction. But I throw two questions.
No, this last one is actually just a byproduct of how we analyze with data investors, but inevitably you have to choose a baseline. And here we chose strong Democrat as a baseline.
Okay.
So with respect to that baseline, you see the effect of rest. So if you were to choose another baseline, you would actually see a different symmetry, asymmetry.
Okay.
It's not something I can solve. The one way would be to throw in independence, but independence, this actually links to the answer to the first question. Independence will actually show some signal of detachment from politics. So what is happening, and has been quite documented by a nice paper by Jim Druckmann again on misperception, is that in this historical moment, if someone in a survey, you say this person is Republican, they do by default imagine someone who is like crazy about politics, talks about it all the time, is heavily involved, is an activist, and is very extreme in his views. So unless you provide a bunch of information that actually makes people understand this person is not that, as soon as you say Democrat or Republican, people jump there. The reason we didn't throw in independent was because we expected that to have this double meaning, not only of being in between, but also being less interested. So we decided not to have that again, because we didn't want to stack things in our favor. Right? Our goal was to show that there is not much going on. So that's why we did it here in this specific thing. So yes, that's why, and to get to the nature of your question, the problem is how politics is thrown in, like describing the neighborhoods as Republican and Democrat, instead of describing them as working class and therefore leaning Democrat because of economic reasons, or like the other way around. But so like essentially, by not going to discuss politics in its specific terms, we just hang to the more symbolic labels. But the symbolic labels, by being only two and being so stereotyped, are not giving us any words. So it's the worst of both worlds, in the sense that people might be avoiding politics. And when politics comes up, it's rarely about specific issues where we might actually find commonalities, or we might find disagreement within our own party. But it's more about like these two labels. And that's also something that is exacerbated by the fact that Republicans and Democrats are, we can discuss on the estimates, but probably less than 50% of the American population. There is like a fair amount of people who identify as independent. If you don't force them, they will actually find themselves as moderates. We tend to force them to actually lean one way or another because we do know that leaning is real. But how real it is in this current era, I don't know. I mean, there is a resistance movement out there of like silent people who are in some ways holding on to their conflicting views. Several of them are economically liberal, but morally conservative, and the other way around. And another effect of continuing to talk about politics with these two terms and studying it only as a function of these two terms is that we never give room and create the space to describe like the other part of America, but still holds to a certain extent. So yes, that's I agree with you. That's exactly what's happening, but that's actually why it's so deleterious in some ways. Okay,
Thank you so much.